Good afternoon, everyone. Can I welcome the 100 or so people on this call for joining us on this webinar about deal making, due diligence, and investigations in uncertain times. And given the turbulent nature of the pandemic and with a possible no-deal Brexit looming, I think we'll struggle to find a better time to tackle these topics. And COVID and the economic repercussions of COVID are exposing organizations worldwide to new and heightened risks. So in today's webinar, we're going to draw on lessons from other periods of crisis to explore what organizations can do to mitigate latent threats, to satisfy stakeholders, and to meet regulatory requirements. It's a privilege to introduce our speakers who bring a wealth of experience in crisis-era corporate intelligence and investigations, as well as years of experience in leadership in the public sector. So can I welcome Alun Milford, a partner in the criminal litigation team at Kingsley Napley, specializing in corporate investigations and prosecuting serious or complex financial crime. And prior to Kingsley Napley, Alun was the general counsel at the Serious Fraud Office. And before that, he worked as a senior government lawyer and public prosecutor. We have Martin Devenish, who's a board director and head of corporate intelligence at SRM, who spearheaded a recent SRM report about the very topic we're discussing. But before joining SRM, Martin was a partner at Goldman Sachs. And thirdly, Henry Williams, head of investigations here at Themis, and who's a former journalist and corporate investigator. So on timings, I'm going to moderate a panel discussion for about 30 minutes, but there'll be plenty of time for questions and a wider discussion. So if you think of a question and you'd like to ask it, please do so using the control panel that will be on your screen. And there are also some resources and handouts for you too. But let's get straight into the meat of the conversation. And I want to start by talking about what we've learned from previous crises. And many of us will have vivid memories of the last big period of economic uncertainty, so the 2008 financial crash and the resulting recession that had a huge impact on jobs, on public debt, and on government policy. So Alun, can I turn to you first? You were at the heart of things in the aftermath of that crash, tackling the financial crime that came to light during the recession. And reflecting on those experiences, how do you compare it to the crisis that we're facing today?
Well, I don't want in any way to downplay the impact of the 2008 crash, but as far as I'm concerned, the pandemic is in the box seat to be the more serious of the two. And that's because, quite aside from, the sheer human misery that the pandemic's inflicted of an order, like nothing else, no economy has escaped. Many economies have contracted both enormously and immediately. And the numbers of sectors which have been hit are simply huge. It's right the way across the economy: manufacturing, retail, leisure, tourism. And from a UK perspective, it's worth bearing in mind that this couldn't really have come at a worse time, because we left the European Union last year, the very end of last year. The government is in the process, or was in the process, of pivoting us away as a country from facing out really to the European Union, now to the wider world. And of course, the impact of the pandemic is that wider world is now a world with shrinking economies. And to the extent that there is an economy that was or looked to have been doing quite well through the pandemic, that was China's. And I think we can all agree that the golden age of cooperation with China is coming to an end, or has come to an end.
Right.
So it's a rough world out there, and this pandemic's had a terrible impact.
Okay, interesting. So the breadth of the impact is greater. The political environment in which it's occurred, it makes it more challenging. And in 2018-19, I remember that crash brought to light a number of serious criminal operations. For example, the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme. And for the corporate investigations industry, it was something of a boom time. And Martin, could you tell us a bit more about the fraud and corruption issues that came to light in the 08-09 financial crash, and potentially bringing in your experiences from other significant crises or recessions? How comparable do you think COVID is to that period in terms of risk?
Yeah, thanks, Gavin, and hello all. I think the first, well, and as Alun has said, I think whilst the cause of the crisis that we're in right now is very different to the cause that we saw in 2008, 2009. I think that there is a similarity, although I agree with that. I think it will be bigger this time. That the significance of the impact is huge. Then you had the financial, the heart of the crisis was in the financial system, and that obviously has tentacles that spread into a whole bunch of sectors, and we're seeing the same thing here. I think if you just, if we just take a moment to think about a couple of stats, and again, if we just take the UK as an example, so from Q1 08 to Q2 09, you saw GDP in the UK drop by about 6%. And it took 5 years plus to recover to pre-crisis levels. And by 2011, we saw 2.7 million people in the UK who were registered as looking for work. And post that crisis, one of the stats that I know Themis you shared with me was the BDO stat, which had a study which looked at the impact of that crisis on fraud or money lost to fraud. And what they found was that in the 5 years between 2007 to 2011, the money lost to fraud was 20% higher than all the money you'd lost to fraud in the previous 10 years, so 97 through to 2007. And there have been countless studies that look at the causality of recession and fraud. I think there's one important point to remember here. And I think one of the differences here, which I'll come back to in a second, but I think one important point to remember here about that is what recessions tend to do is uncover fraud that's been going on for some time. And there is a great quote by Warren Buffett that says you only see who's swimming naked when the tide goes out. And we have already started to see some of those crises, some of those accounting frauds come to the fore. It's hard to pin them on COVID because they're kind of early into this process. But think of Luckin Coffee, which was where the fraud there involved overstating sales. Wirecard is another high-profile fraud investigation that has just kicked off. And obviously, back in the UK, you've got Patisserie Valerie as an example of a company where the environment we are finding ourselves in is starting to uncover. So as the recession has its impact on a slowdown, I think one difference here though is we're going to get some fraud that's happening right now before our very eyes. I know we're going to come back to how we think the current crisis and the response is creating a whole bunch of opportunities for fraud to happen right now. So I think one of the differences here is we're going to see both. We're going to see this uncover some fraud that's been going on for some time, and people have been laissez-faire, lackadaisical. It's easy to paper over the cracks when business is booming. And as Alun said, that stopped, and it stopped immediately. But I think we're also going to be seeing some, for want of a better phrase, concurrent fraud to this crisis as the money gets dispersed. There are three things I would highlight in terms of differences between now and 2008 and 2009 that will make the impact much bigger. The first we've already touched on, which the impact here has been faster, harder, and it's happened to everyone at the same time. The second fact, partly because of that, we have seen governments disperse hundreds of billions of dollars in effectively a heartbeat. And whilst you can't criticize them for the speed and the desire to get that money into the system quickly, usually speed when you're dispersing that amount of money does not end well 100% of the time, and I'm pretty sure we're going to see that. And the third thing, which you could say, if I could put it this way, you could phrase it as a bit of a success of this crisis, which is the ability of people to work in a dispersed nature, but also the acceleration in digitization of the economy and how we live our lives. Clearly, some of that stuff is going to have long-lasting positive effects. The flip side of that is it is a much more fertile hunting ground for cyber criminals, for example, which is what.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. And so let's keep those three drivers in mind for later in the discussion. But just to finish off the comparisons between now and the COVID-related crisis, Henry, you were working as a financial journalist, I think, in the previous period. And what memories stand out for you?
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. I think it's quite interesting what Martin said about swimming naked with no clothes, because I think that's kind of what the experience was. I remember interviewing a senior director at HSBC in late 2006 and having to ask him why his third quarter results were so bad. And he turned around and said, it's nothing to worry about, it's just some losses in our US subprime mortgage portfolio, which I had to ask my editor what he meant. And sadly, I think the rest of us had to find out what he meant. So what the point of that is, though, is that you can never back down and imagine HSBC would suddenly be done for laundering close to $1 billion for a Mexican drug cartel or for sanctions busting in Iraq and Syria. And I mean, I think some of these things are linked in the sense that, you know, the sort of poor governance which saw these dodgy loans being made equally reflects their compliance practices, which were proven to be poor. And I think the FinCEN thing shows that even when they're under investigation by the US government, these practices were continuing. But it became a focus. The banks, had got us into this crisis, and suddenly governments were under pressure to really look into them. And so Senator Carl Levin comes knocking on the door of HSBC, and these things get exposed. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing again this time round, is we're going to see renewed scrutiny on people, and it's going to be much more in depth. And there's going to be some ticking time bombs out there. Finally, I'd also just like to mention, I don't know if we quite know what the fraud's going to look like yet. For instance, when we were dealing with 2008, one of the ways regulators got us back onto our feet was by collapsing interest rates. That caused asset prices to inflate, and we got a flood of dirty money coming into London from very dodgy places, and people were chasing that money. So essentially, you have the US subprime loans crisis causes dirty money to turn up in London. It's not going to be a direct correlation. Obviously, we're going to be looking at sort of COVID procurement contracts as a major source of fraud, but there's going to be other unknown things which we're going to have to keep our eyes on.
Okay, that's really interesting. And so let's pick up the points made, I think, by all three of you around the nature of the risks facing organizations now and COVID-related fraud in particular. And I think all of the people on the call will be aware of the concerning increase in COVID-related scams, cyber attacks, and abuse of the pandemic stimulus program. And furlough fraud, just to take an example, has been covered relatively recently in the media. But just to bring our audience in here, I just want to run a poll to see whether we can test whether we've really understood the scale of the issue. So feel free to answer. The question is, according to HMRC's latest estimates, how much has the UK paid out in furlough money on fraudulent or mistaken claims? So feel free to place your bets there. But as you're doing so, I think it's worth mentioning that clearly we're looking at this from a UK perspective, but it's a global challenge. And if you take the figures in the United States adjusted for inflation, the COVID-related support that they've put in place is more than they spent on the Vietnam War, the Apollo program, and the New Deal. In fact, it's 20 times the size of the Marshall Plan, which gives you an idea of the figures involved worldwide. So I hope that's given everyone a chance to answer the question, and a good range of answers. The correct answer is actually the one that most of you picked, just under a third of you picked, which is about the head of HMRC told MPs at the beginning of September that the government has paid out up to £3.5 billion in furlough money to fraudulent or mistaken claims, and that's about between 5 and 10% of all the money distributed through some of the COVID job retention schemes. And so, Alun, turning back to you and drawing on your experience in government and elsewhere, could you tell us about the scale and nature of the crime risks that are facing organisations?
Yeah, I mean, just stepping back for a second, I think it's always sort of helpful to sort of conceptualize a little bit. And you've got the fraud triangle, which sort of criminologists have evolved, and sort of identifying the factors which sort of underpin fraudulent activity. You've got these three sort of considerations which sit alongside each other. The first, opportunity, something to steal, a way to do it. The second is motive, greed, desperation, pressure. And then the third is rationalization, or just how the human being justifies to him or herself why it is they're about to do that which they're about to do. And so, that might be a risk reward analysis. I'm not going to get caught. Or it could be a sense of entitlement. It could be sort of profoundly short-term attitude, something like that. So these are the factors in play. So we have that, I think, is properly understood. We've also got the situation in which we really don't know quite yet how things are playing out. We might have the 3.5 billion figure, but the head of HMRC can't separate the fraudulent from the mistaken at this stage. And the criminal justice systems, one of the ironies of the pandemic is it stopped the criminal justice system, or at least severely delayed it. So we don't really know what's in the pipeline. So instead, what we're going to get some, I think, confident predictions of the types of things we might see. And in terms of that, well, I mean, some of it, channeling my Warren Buffett, is going to be stuff which has been going on, which is going to be exposed. And Martin's already touched on a couple of those examples. But as businesses go bust, insolvency practitioners are going to be turning that up. Or as people decide to sell businesses and just trade in businesses, so due diligence exercises are going to expose some more of that as well. And some are going to be frauds which are, or indeed corruption offences, which are generated by the circumstances of the pandemic. And I'm thinking here in particular about companies in crisis. Are they going to be more likely to misrepresent their financial health and falsify reporting? Are people going to consider themselves under a greater pressure to win that contract through corrupt means than perhaps before? And particularly at a time when the United Kingdom's sort of going to try to turn its economy to a more world-facing new market kind of place. So you've got that. You've also got the question of the scope of the opportunity for fraud from the furlough scheme and from all that government money which is washing around. And we've already covered the potential scale at this early stage. Companies have also got risks from insiders, possibly as a consequence of the way in which its working patterns or the means in which it goes about that a business has changed. And so if operations and sales are online, then are there more opportunities for bad actors within the company to falsify sales figures to make them look as if they're performing better, to increase their rewards? Similarly, as more employees work at home, then what might previously have looked suspicious in terms of access to data at particular times of the day wouldn't, perhaps appear so different as flexible working has become king. So, for example, how easily can a company in this kind of context enforce its strict data controls or data controls which were, strict before March?
Right.
And companies are also at risk of being victim from outsiders as well. And I'm thinking here about supply chains. PPE would be the easy pandemic example. But as you've got new partners, invoicing frauds or technology attacks on the company's technology, presumably, particularly as it moves to that kind of platform. So we're looking at phishing, we're looking at data thefts, we're looking at internet-related scams. There's the whole range.
Okay, really, really helpful. And I'm sure some of the audience will have questions for you and for Martin and for Henry. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask any of the panel a question, please add it into the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll come to it shortly. But I want to move on to the public views and stakeholder activism. And I think that partly because of the confusion around government messaging, but other things, clearly the impact on every member of the public has been enormous, whether you've been homeschooling or because the pubs are going to shut at 10 o'clock. But more importantly, we're going to see large-scale spending cuts, tax hikes, and huge spikes in unemployment. And Martin, in your view, are those challenges and public engagement with the public policy environment that we all find ourselves in, are we witnessing a shift towards greater societal scrutiny of organizations and stakeholder activism?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are. I think this is, and I would highlight this as one other big difference from 2008 and 2009, and that is the backdrop against which this is happening. And I think Alun's already pointed out Brexit specific to the UK, but I think, I think that backdrop has some is seeing society ask some pretty big questions, specific to the pandemic. What parts of society are more vulnerable to the pandemic, and importantly, why are they more vulnerable? We've got the whole equality of opportunity, the Black Lives Matter campaigns. We've got climate change is still out there, and also partly, I guess, related to Brexit. Partly, if you look at some of the trade talk that's going on around the world, there's this question over globalization. Society is asking, okay, well, was that good or was it bad? And so I think it's the backdrop that is going to play a big role in society being much more focused as a group than perhaps they have been in economic recessions and crises in the past. And you mentioned the Dealing in Uncertainty publication from earlier this year. I mean, that was one of the themes. Do we think this is going to increase stakeholder capitalism? Now, I think as we all know, and I'm sure everyone is very familiar on the phone, the ESGs are not a new phenomenon, and I think and I don't think stakeholder capitalism is a new phenomenon that's coming out of this. I think it will accelerate momentum towards that. I think the interesting thing that is going to change, though, is the S is one that's probably been least well defined, and not ignored, but hasn't quite had the attention that the environmental piece or the governance piece has. Now, if you look at most, there's a whole range of things you can chuck into a social bucket. Most of the definitions include things like labor laws, good working practice, health and safety, equality of opportunity, promotion of diversity, consumer protection, product safety. So it's quite a broad range. But I think that social of the ESG is now staking its claim, and I think that because of the way we are, because of the backdrop to this crisis, I think the antennae are up a lot more sharply. You're right, as you say, Gavin. The impact is on everybody. It's immediate, and so actually similar to the financial crisis, there is a real sense that this is our money that the government have just been using to support economies, which will benefit us, but support companies and support the world, quite frankly, to keep going in this. But it's taxpayer money. And by the way, it's taxes that are probably only going one way. So it's going to become more of our money, or a greater share of our money going forward. And so I think the keenness with which people will watch that is only going one way. Scrutiny is on its way up. I think the second thing I would say is the expectations are only also going one way. They are growing. And I think it's important for companies and for us all, and when we get to the point about due diligence, the expectations, something Alun mentioned, are not just on you as the company. They are on your supply chain. You don't need to own them. You just need to do business with them. And if they don't behave well, then it is coming back to your front door. It's also, quite frankly, on the jurisdictions in which you choose to set up business, where you do set up your manufacturing. And so all of these things are coming together. And so I think, scrutiny's up, expectations are up, and finally, the audience that cares about this stuff has just got a lot bigger. Traditionally, you could say regulators, NGOs, there weren't enough of them, the odd activist, more activist institutional investor, and a few activist groups. Well, to that list now, you're certainly adding your employees, you're adding your consumers, and you're adding the public at large. And as an aside, the public at large are also chucking the regulators into who am I watching now? Because I think in the past, Alan, this is not directed at anything in specifically, but I think in the past there is a view that some regulators, I was in the financial service, that some regulators fell down on duty as well. And so I think all of that is going to make this a pretty difficult climate to negotiate, probably quite rightly, for a few years to come.
Okay, that's really interesting. And so, Henry, can I just ask you relatively briefly, just to build on Martin's views and just to outline how you see the move to greater energy and stakeholder capitalism playing out?
Yeah, sure. So I think, taking on board what Martin says, I think actually it's the activism's going to become huge, which I don't think happened last time. I think you had stuff like the Occupy movement, but I can't think of anything that movement actually achieved. Whereas since 2008, what you have now is you've got Twitter, which, like it or loathe it, is a very convenient means for people to hold previously out of touch organizations to account. And at the moment, the organizations don't really know how to deal with it. So they are coming under very strong scrutiny from this. I think the other thing which is really interesting, and I think it's going to be a much bigger development, is what we're seeing with the FinCEN files, where you have people like the Investigative Consortium of Investigative Journalists, who can spend 16 months poring over a leak of data to really dig in and find the stories which ordinarily you never have a hope of looking into, who owns a BVI company, financial flows, all these kind of things. And a lot of this happens from what people call hack and leak operations, where someone will go into Mossack Fonseca, hack all their documents and bring them out, and suddenly you've got the Panama Papers. But also you've got, for instance, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism has just received 2 years funding from the Open Society Foundation to look at London's role in facilitating international fraud. So we're now in a sort of much wider scrutiny environment, but also a much more in-depth scrutiny environment. And again, it's going to come back to, we're talking about deal making in turbulent times. A lot of firms which previously had clean records, if there are any skeletons in their closet, they're much more likely to be found now. So I think it's a really interesting time for investigators, to be honest. It's going to be a real case of what's this space.
Okay. And so to pick it up on that, onto a third area of conversation around making sure there are as few skeletons in the closet as possible, and on good and bad practice and lessons. So we've talked about how firms are facing increased risks and more stakeholder pressure to do the right thing. Turning back to you, Alun, I'm sure you've seen many examples of good and bad practice when it comes to business conduct under pressure. And so what messages do you have for organizations that are struggling as a result of pressure from the pandemic?
The key message is that now is not the time to let your guard down on your internal controls. Now's the time to reinforce them. That message is not just got to be understood in the boardroom, it's got to be understood across the company as well. For directors, it's about prioritizing those messages around culture, tone from the top, making sure that training hasn't been forgotten as people have tried to respond to the immediate pressures of the pandemic and the way in which people are working differently. That shouldn't be slipping through the net. That's the way in which you deliver your messages about how business is to be done. I think for the compliance teams, they should really have been busy over the last 6 months. You know, are their risk assessments up to date? Do they reflect the changed way in which the company is now doing business? Have they included, in particular, any reassessment of bribery risk, bearing in mind not least the particularly straightforward way for law enforcement to fix a company with liability for bribery? Have you looked through your contracts and payment systems? Have you looked at your agents again? What risk might they pose? Overseas agents, local agents as well. So there's lots of that. Monitoring as well. That needs to be done. How often? Who by? Are you adhering to the 4 Eyes principle? And underpinning that is the point that, you know, Martin makes the point about perception of regulators and law enforcement, but you know, they're positioning themselves now. The director of the Serious Fraud Office has made unambiguously clear that she is very, very motivated to take on cases falling out of the pandemic. So, you know, now is the time to make sure you've got those protections in place.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that is, I suspect lots of note-taking is going on from our attendees on the call. Can I pick up one point about supply chains and COVID-related procurement contracts? I think, Martin, you mentioned this 10 or 15 minutes ago. Is there more potential for misspending or irregular procurement contracts at the moment? And what's your assessment of what this looks like in the UK at the moment?
Well, I think it's not, and it's, you know, not specific to the UK. I think there's two overriding drivers here. One is speed, which we've already touched on. So, you know, the speed of the speed with which we went into this crisis, and the speed, I guess what we're talking about here specifically is the speed of the response. And I think the second thing is the scale. You know, I mean, I don't know how many people on this call were familiar with the city of Wuhan on Jan 1. By the end of Jan, we were, you know, Wuhan went into lockdown sort of third week of Jan. Within 3 months, you had pretty much 100% of the global GDP in lockdown with it. So I think, you know, and we've touched on scale before as well. So I think, you know, those are the two drivers which lead on to why the response was so fast. Now, I actually personally, I think it's hard to be critical of the desire for speed here. You know, I mean, the reality was lots of people were dying. Sadly, you know, a lot of people are still dying, and in a lot of places, you know, and we could arguably say, as of today, given the direction of travel in the UK here too, you know, the virus is back out of control again. So I think it's hard to be critical of governments for speed. And in that, and so if you start from that position, you can see why potentially some of the procurement processes were put to one side. The traditional procurement processes were put to one side. But I think there's an important point here, and I'm not sure you can excuse governments or companies, for that matter, to do this. And whilst there was an absolute need to have very fast decision making, I think what that means is your whole thought process and your whole diligence process just needs to get a lot faster. You don't skip it completely, and you know, and I think that is the risk that we have seen here. I mean, you know, in the UK, you know, these are reports, right? So I have no idea whether these are true, but you know, the reports contain some reasonably factual information. But you know, you know, some of the stories range from a pest control company that has net assets of 18,000 quid getting a 32 million pound contract to supply surgical gowns. Now, I don't know, you know, whether the people in that pest control business have a history of supply chain management in medical PPE, but it doesn't look like it on the surface. You know, the other scale is you have a 133 million pound testing contract given to a testing company, so at least they're in the right industry. But there was one bidder. In fact, I'm not even sure it was put out to any sort of bids. There was one tender, and now the story is that particular company is hitting turnaround times on the testing in only 1 in 10 cases. And so I think that the context within which they started down this process of speed and relaxing the procurement is understandable. The question will be, and I think this is what will happen with the passage of time, I'm not sure it will be forgivable 2 or 3 years from now, because I think what we have seen from these crises, and this is where I think public opinion will shift as well, when you're in the middle of the crisis, you forgive quite a bit. As the peak or depth, whichever way you want to look at that crisis, dulls, that lens starts to harden. And I think as and when governments are seen to have wasted millions, maybe tens, maybe hundreds of millions of taxpayers' money, back to what we were talking about, society holding people to account and the backdrop, I think that will harden quite quickly. And I think, as we all know, the scale of this means this is going to go on for a little while. And so I fully expect this stuff to run and run. So I think I can understand the relaxation, but I think, you do your homework faster. You don't not do your homework. And that's true of governments, that's true of companies.
Okay, interesting. And obviously the public inquiry that will follow will go on for some time, one imagines, and cover these sorts of issues. Just before we open up to questions, and again, we've got a couple of questions coming in, and I'm delighted to take as many as we can. I want to go back to something that Henry talked about at the beginning of the call around the challenges of dealing with the inflows of foreign investment, or certainly countries looking for greater inflow. So just picking up on Martin's point around new contracts, about foreign direct investment inflows and business activity, let me just go to the audience and ask them about what they view as some of the obstacles to doing business in the coming year. So this is our second poll and our last poll. So the question is, in your opinion, what is the biggest concern surrounding deal making in COVID and post-COVID environment? So there are 4 options there. And just turning to you, Henry, while the audience answers that question, could you mention some of the concerns that investigators are facing dealing with this environment?
Yeah, sure. I think there's some of the obvious ones which people have talked about before in the past, such as, how do you interview people when it's only remotely? Can you really trust a Zoom conversation? Who else is on that Zoom conversation? There's other interesting things like, how do you do surveillance at the moment when, potentially people are all working from home? So the classic of following someone from their office to their storehouse where they kept all their documents, you can't really do anymore at the moment. But I think there's a sort of a wider thing, which I think is going to be quite interesting for investigators, which is there's going to be new red flags coming out, and there's going to be new risk protocols coming out. And it's going to be quite a steep learning curve for investigators to find out what those are and incorporate them when they're doing their due diligence and their investigations. And I think it can only really come from keeping an eye on the news and keeping educated about what's going on. We can theorize about what the big issues are. But really, it's just being constantly aware of how things are changing, because I do think it's going to change quite rapidly.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So let's see whether the audience agree and pick that up. So so about half of you worried about higher state spending and the corruption risk. I think we've covered that. Just under a third looking at the solvency of business partners. And then others around ESG challenges and competition for distressed assets. Martin, what are your reflections on those responses?
I think that if I just take them in turn, I think clearly the solvency issue is going to be important, and I think Alun touched on the nature of some of the investigations that are done around distressed assets and distressed sales. And of course, when you start to look at those sorts of transactions, you start to get other players. You've got the creditors that start to get involved as well, the insolvency practitioners as well. So I think some of the aspects of to what you start to look at in that situation, you tend to look at a lot more. There's a bit more asset tracing. Where are these assets? Who owns these assets?
Right.
And actually, very specifically, that was one of the first things as part of the Wirecard investigation, which obviously will run for some time, is just where is this money and where are the assets? I think in terms of the government spend and corruption risk there, I don't even think we're at the start of that. I think that is going to be a massive issue for a long time. And I think, and it's not only, I mean, you know, there are, well, dangerous thing to say there are shades of corruption. That's not what I mean. I mean, there is corruption or there isn't corruption, but I think there are other aspects to that government bailouts and support. You know, there'll be profiteering investigations, there'll be cronyism investigations. I think all of this stuff, as well as the outright the outright fraud. I do think, as I said, and you know, the fact that I spoke about it, I think the S is going to become more important, and I don't think that's going away. And I also, you know, I'll touch on that in a second, I guess, with just some of the work we've been seeing and some of the questions we've been seeing. It's not necessarily a new trend, but it's getting much more prevalence in the diligence than it did before. And I've forgotten what the fourth option was there that people ticked: government spending, solvency, distressed asset. Oh, E. Maybe I did get it all.
I think you did them. So
okay.
Well done.
Okay.
So I'm going to give everyone a couple of minutes for your questions, but I want to ask Alun a final question for the panel. So when we were talking yesterday, we were talking about how financial crises are a bit like fishing with dynamite. You know, we see the minnows float to the surface, and then suddenly we see there's a whale arrive, this big issue. How long do you think it's going to take, Alun, to see the full scale of the issues that have occurred already?
Yeah, I didn't buy the metaphor then, and I'm not sure I'm buying it now, Gavin. We're at the start of a second wave, aren't we? And let's change the metaphor, and that wave crashes, then we'll see the devastation that's been sort of wrought by it.
That's better than the whale. Okay, but the wave has to crash and really go out before you see. Yeah, it takes some time.
But Martin did, you know, make the point about corruption. There are certain kinds of crime which sort of are more hidden than others. So, you know, if the investor, you know, if someone is obviously out of pocket, that comes to light sooner than the corruption offence. The corruption offences I sort of regard as slow burners, and they're going to come to light for many years to come.
Okay, great. No, okay, that's great. Well, look, I appreciate the insight on how this is different to other crises, from some of the COVID-related fraudulent activities to the stakeholder environment, and to good and bad practice, and the sort of timeline that we're working to. I want to take a couple of questions. We've got 5 or 6 questions, and I'd like just to go to Alun first, if you don't mind. Go back to you, Alun. You mentioned that these changes that organizations need to make are not academic, that the regulators and law enforcement are absolutely focused on the challenges. Can you just talk to me about whether, in your experience, these sorts of major crises change the regulatory environment quite quickly, or if at all?
What it'll do is impact the priorities that law enforcement has and that regulators have, and perhaps that is a lesson of 2008. We've already seen, with the diminution in the amount of cases going through the court system, it's particularly at the height of the first wave, law enforcement and the Crown Prosecution Service having overtly to prioritize cases, and they were, you know, the priorities were, in essence, cases involving life and limb and cases involving pandemic fraud. And so, you know, the real priority in getting rid of COVID scammers was identified at the outset, and it's evident from the work of the FCA, the SFO, the announcements from the CPS, that the priority is going to be amongst the gamut of frauds, pandemic related frauds, they're going to prioritize that.
Okay, clear. We've got a question to circle back, particularly on what Martin said, but I'm going to put it to Henry if you don't mind. The question is, we talked about the impacts of financial crime on the S in ESG. Do you, Henry, have any good examples of this, or where external stakeholders have taken a stand because of poor practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really fascinating one at the moment, which is the whole Rio Tinto issue, where it's blown up Aboriginal sites. And I mean, the really interesting thing about this is Rio Tinto actually had permission from the Australian government to do so. But obviously, what they've done has blown up 40,000 years worth of history, and it's reflected really badly on them. So yeah, I think that's a very sort of modern example. Then, you know, back in the UK, we had the whole boohoo situation, which again has brought the focus of modern slavery much more to light than I think it's previously has been, because I think people can suddenly really see that this is a first world country engaging in sort of some pretty horrific practices and not doing enough to stamp them out. So when we're talking about the S in ESG, I think it's going to remain a huge thing. And also, I think it's the best one for a sort of due diligence investigators almost to go after, because there's some really tangible results you can get there. It's not like looking at sort of carbon pollution or anything like that. This is actually, you know, there's supply chains and there's subsidiary companies and there's things to really look out for and get your teeth into, which can actually have a really tangible effect when you're doing an investigation.
Right. And Henry, use the example from Australia, and there's a question in the chat, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, if you'd like to add any question for Martin. Martin, so a question says, Martin, are there any differences to the threat landscape in COVID responses across different continents and regions that you've seen as part of your work with SRM?
I mean, not really, not yet. Okay. I think the COVID, as I said, I think that specifically the COVID response will start to play out, and the financial crime and fraud around it will start to play out over the coming year, 2 years, 3 years. I mean, so if you look at it globally, I think it's hard to point to any differences. I think there's something that just to pick up on something Henry said, I think that what we are seeing, well, we're seeing two things definitely that are not, well, one's a bit newer than the other, but you know, where we're seeing accelerating. One is, and Alun mentioned this earlier, there is a lot more focus on the culture of the organization, a lot more. Now, some of that is, there's always been a focus on the reputation, you know, when you're looking at doing diligence around a deal, or quite frankly, a supply chain, a supplier, you know, the reputation of the corporate, the reputation of the senior management, how's that company perceived by customers, by competitors sometimes, you know, and that's a lot of work we do. Culture has become even more important, back to something Alun mentioned, when you've now got, if you've gone from having 30,000 people in 6 offices around the world that you can watch over, you know, rightly or wrongly, you can watch a bit more closely, to having 30,000 people in 30,000 offices, home offices around the world. Your culture matters. It always mattered. It matters a lot more now. And so there's a lot more questions about really wanting to understand the culture of the company. Now, you know, as has been said many times, so I can't claim this phrase, but you know, culture is not what the senior execs tell you it is. Culture is what the person at the bottom feels it is, because that's how they behave. And so I think we've spent a lot of time working with our clients to really try and get a sense of that. The other thing, irrespective of jurisdiction, is partly related with COVID and digitization and dispersal, but generally trend is cyber due diligence is just now more ubiquitous than it has been as a request. And it's not just companies and industries that have a lot of data, it's anyone. Because you know, it's not about theft as much as it used to be, it's actually about ransomware. So I don't care if you've got any data that I can take, if I can just block your systems, send you a check for, you know, a request for $1 million as a ransomware, then I'm fine with that. You know, I don't need to steal anything. So I think, and I think that will. So it's not a regional. It's not. You know, it's not really answering. It's not a difference regionally. We're seeing that request grow everywhere for that cyber due diligence. Henry mentioned Twitter. You know, when you're looking at culture, you're looking at reputation. Now there's a lot more dark web searching going on. What's the chat out there? Is there any chat out? Social media, all that sort of stuff.
Right. Okay. No, I think that's interesting. I've got a question from James around reg tech transactions. So James is saying, from a reg tech transactional point of view, are the panel seeing greater amounts of false positives and noise from the COVID-related fraud? Who would like to take this? Can I ask Henry to take this? I know that on other webinars we talked about the power of AI and RegTech to look at this, Henry, but what are you seeing?
Well, I think in terms of false positives, I think at the moment it's yet to filter through the sort of what we're talking about in terms of this heightened risk environment. Is we're yet to see that wave crash, so to speak. So I don't think we are seeing false positives here. I mean, I think we're seeing some great piece of investigation where, you know, people are finding sort of cronyism in PPE contracts, or, you know, for instance, a company which was set up 2 days ago suddenly winning a major government contract, which I think was here in the UK. So I think we're seeing real cases rather than false positives. And it will be something for AI to filter later down the line, but I don't think it's an issue now. And just with AI, obviously, AI is only ever an enhancement to a physical investigator. It can't do these things on its own, and we certainly shouldn't trust it to.
Okay, interesting.
I mean, sorry, Gavin, if I can just add one thing there. I think it's a related point, but Henry's mentioned the FinCEN papers a few times, and obviously, you know, as people will know, I have a background in financial services. Reading through some of this stuff, I think you know, obviously there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of reg tech, there's a lot that's been going on, particularly in those high volume banks, and so a lot of this stuff is getting detected. It's interesting to think how suspicious activity requests or reports, are being used in that context. It's actually, it reads almost as if, okay, my reg tech has suggested that might be suspicious. If I file one of these, job done. I can still do the trade. I can still take the fee. And so, you know, as I say, it's a slightly different, it's a different answer to the specific question, but it's almost given banks a get out of jail free card. You know, I reported this as I was asked to do. I'm good to go. I said it was suspicious. I didn't block it. And so I think, you know, a lot of what reg tech is doing, a lot of transaction monitoring is clearly, you know, alerting a lot more of these. I think that there will be, you know, away from reg tech, I think there probably are going to be a lot of false positives, right, in this whole crisis, largely because society does care, a lot of people care, there'll be a lot of reporting of suspicious activity, and so there'll probably be a lot of chasing around of stuff that doesn't really land you anywhere. So I think generally, because I think we'll all see the incidents and the reporting go up, there'll probably be a few more, but I just, you know, I thought just looking at the FinCEN stuff, it's interesting how these SARs appear to have been used by some of the banks.
Right, I think that's really interesting, and I just want to take that opportunity, because I know the audience will be interested in perspectives from others. Alun, do you have a perspective on FinCEN and what the lessons are for COVID-related issues or more generally?
Nothing that's different to what Henry and Martin have just said.
Right.
And you know, the FinCEN story is going to run and run, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah,
the wave is yet to crash. Okay, so let me just see whether we've got any more questions. I think we've answered the questions that were posed. I'm grateful for those, and I'm sorry if we haven't covered all of the questions that were answered. And as with all of the webinars with SRM and others, the team will be, the panelists are able to answer questions on the Themis Senate after this webinar. So if you have questions or thoughts, you can continue the conversation directly with them. And there are instructions about how to join the Themis Senate with the handouts that you've also got on the right-hand side of your screen. And so really, I just wanted to draw our conversation to a close. But before I do that, does anyone on the panel want to make any final observations or closing thoughts?
Not for me, thank you, Gavin.
You've all done a wonderfully good job, so there's no need to.
Maybe. Sorry, Gavin. There's one question about modern
Please.
slavery, and do we think it's a increasing feature that someone's asked specifically
yes,
to me?
Please. Yeah, let's take that. Let's take that.
So the short answer to that is yes. I mean, I think the supply chain, there is an increasing due diligence recognition, as I touched on before, that you can outsource your supplies. You can't outsource your reputation. And so whether that is a working conditions, it's a modern slavery, it's a crime and corruption. And there have been a few examples. I take you back to, I think in 2012, there was a Bangladesh garment fire, got a bit of publicity. 2013, there was a garment factory that collapsed. Gucci, Benetton, Prada, Matalan, Primark, all of them dragged into it. It's becoming an increasing feature in due diligence for sure.
Right,
I think
absolutely.
And just to add to that, it's becoming increasingly sort of accepted sort of criminal justice standard as well. So not just the Modern Slavery Act, and I see the question was viewed as not really having teeth, but the idea that the criminal law is going to get involved in looking at supply chain related issues was new. And recently we've got the Magnitsky Act sort of sanctions, human rights sanctions coming in as well. So no, this is new territory for the criminal justice system, one it seems keen to sort of stake its ground on.
Right. No, yeah, I'm sure that's right. Very good. Okay. Well, look, in the interest of time, I just draw our discussion to a close. I think we've learned how the COVID crisis is likely to have even wider impacts on financial crime than the previous crises that we've lived through. And we've talked about some of the reasons for that. We've talked about, Alun talked about 5 things that organizations can do today to help protect them from some of these risks. Martin has talked compellingly about ESG, stakeholder activism, and public opinion. And Henry has given us a range of examples and issues that investigators will be looking at, and talked about some of the risks that we face. So I'm incredibly grateful for, we had up to 100 people on the call who joined us. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. And particular thanks to Alun, Milford, Martin, Devenish, and Henry Williams. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your insight.
Thank you.
Thanks.